It is January 9th, 2025, and we may have just seen the last official meeting of the so-called Ukraine Defense Contact Group, at least in its current form, as leaders from the countries that essentially make up the NATO and Friends group got together at Germany's Ramstein Air Base to talk about how much they love war in Ukraine. We heard from Zelensky, who gave a speech in which he called on NATO allies to deploy troops to Ukraine, claiming that it would help force Russia to peace. But nothing that Kiev or any of the NATO allies have done has forced Russia to the negotiating table. Not when they launched an incursion into Russia's Kursk region, not when they decided that they were going to launch long-range missiles deep inside Russian territory. None of it. So why do they think that escalating to World War III would take Russia to this point where they would act like they have to get to the negotiating table? In fact, this entire time you've had Ukraine and the entire NATO alliance acting as if Kiev is the one winning this war and refusing to acknowledge reality when it tells them otherwise. We got into all of the latest in what's at stake in the upcoming talks, the upcoming meetings, and the new Trump administration. We talked about all of that earlier with a special guest. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Glenn Diesen, a geopolitical analyst, author, and professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway. Professor Diesen, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on the show. And I want to get your take on the latest here, because I know that this so-called Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which is essentially NATO and Friends, held its 25th meeting today. And this took place at Germany's Ramstein Air Base. And during a speech there, Zelensky called for NATO to deploy troops to Ukraine, claiming it would, quote, force Russia to peace. Now, anyone who is paying attention knows that this would mean World War III. But how do you think that NATO sees the state of the Ukraine war right now? Is there a threat of the alliance trying to officially deploy troops, even as, or rather, especially as Kiev's manpower shortage gets even worse?
Well, I think it's a last desperate effort to keep the war going. And but again, I emphasize desperate because I don't see anyone having the appetite for sending in troops. But of course, there's been an effort to sabotage Trump's desire to end the war, which seems to be quite genuine. Again, this is one of the reasons why there's been so much escalations since Trump won the victory. Keep in mind that the long-range missile strikes, the ATACMS, that the Biden administration held that off for almost 3 years because it was such a reckless escalation. And as Russians point out, it represents a direct attack by the US on Russia. And he then suddenly authorized it after Trump won the presidency. So this is all efforts to sabotage the peace. Now, obviously, it's not working. It's not changing much on the battlefield or anything. And things keep going from bad to worse for NATO and Ukraine. So now, of course, Trump comes in. There's a risk that peace might break out. So in order to continue this long war, they're looking at other ways. And of course, sending in NATO troops, the whole idea is that Russia wouldn't dare to attack these regions. I think they would be sorely mistaken if they think this. I think as soon as they enter Ukrainian territory, the Russians would actually prioritize to strike NATO troops because they need to. Failing to do so would be set a very dangerous precedent. So I think the NATO understands this. So I doubt that anyone with 11 days left until Trump takes over, that is, a serious proposition. But again, it shows the desperation, though.
Yeah, and you make a really good point there that the Biden administration, they could have done this much earlier, right? They could have removed those restrictions on long-range strikes and a number of other things that they have gradually done as they've gone down the slippery slope. But waiting until they knew that Trump was coming back, until they knew that, the next president was going to be someone who has actively campaigned on wanting the war in Ukraine to end. And now all of a sudden they start doing everything that they can to escalate. I also thought it was interesting because when Zelensky was speaking today, he said that Kiev's partnership with NATO has come such a long way that it would be crazy to drop the ball now. He was, of course, referring to, Trump coming into office, the possibility of ties changing. And there seems to be a lot of concern over Trump's arrival, not just about him ending the war, but I mean, you've got these reports that the foreign ministers from Germany, France, and Poland are already planning a show of unity trip to the US after Trump's inauguration. And I haven't seen any indication that Trump would come in and try to pull the US out of the NATO alliance, or that he would even end support totally for Ukraine. So why do you think there's so much scrambling to not only Trump-proof that support, but also to get NATO ready to, deal with the new US president? Is this a lot of concern that isn't warranted, or is there more to it?
Well, I think Trump's priorities are quite different from that of Biden. That is, I think he recognized this has been a very expensive war for the United States. And even if you wanted to continue this, I mean, Biden and NATO is doing everything they can for Ukraine to win, but they're exhausted. They don't have enough manpower, they don't have enough weapons, and the Russians are, again, going from strength to strength. So the war is lost, and it's very costly. And furthermore, it's pushing Russia closer to China. Trump has other priorities. He would rather focus on China. So obviously, this means that Russia will be deprioritized. The US will shift its resources and focus to Asia. All of this is something that worries the Europeans, of course, because in Europe, we bet everything on the collective hegemony of the West. And suddenly, Europe is not only becoming very much subordinated to the US, but now the US is also, setting its eyes more on Asia. So it's bad for Europe, or at least European leaders believe this is bad for a variety of reasons. But I do think Trump's probably going to continue. He's not going to end. Will capitulate in the Ukraine war. Weapons will probably still come. I think it will shift more of the responsibility over to the Europeans. Just so they have to pay for this. That would be an ideal scenario, but no. But I do think that that special partnership, the transatlantic partnership, will take on a very different format. And now that Trump says he will take Greenland as well, this is something that shakes the Europeans a bit, because. We've been saying that it's the Russians who's going to come and invade us all, and suddenly it's the United States that will come and seize our territories. So it's very different. It changes a lot of things. But in regards to this show of force, I think it's also I made a comment before that this is too little, too late. To have Poland, France, and Germany stomp their feet in Washington. What does it really mean? So far, Biden put sanctions on European industries which worked on Nord Stream, most likely, or guaranteed the United States blew up the critical infrastructure of Europe for our energy, that is Nord Stream. They pushed this Inflation Reduction Act, which is purging or cannibalizing German industries. What did the Germans do? Well, the Polish, Sikorski, which will join this team, he thanked America for destroying this. President of Germany gave a medal to Biden. So, there's so much weakness. I don't understand what power and unity they're going to show Trump. Also, I don't think he cares that much anymore. I think, as I said, the priorities have shifted to Asia.
Yeah, that's almost kind of the shocking part. And I know that even in just the last 3 years, looking back, and especially looking at countries in Europe, looking at Germany and France in particular, and going, okay, I would think that they had a certain amount of strength, maybe even a certain amount of independence. Maybe there was that reliance on the US all along, but to go from where they were 3 years ago to now where they are, and this idea of the US pulling back its support for Ukraine, even somewhat, and then Europe now being in a position where they're having to carry that responsibility, as you were noting. I just wonder, okay, is the expectation that the US is still going to be calling the shots and Europe is going to be handling things, or are they really going to be taking things on? And could that put them even closer to a direct war with Russia? Because the US gets to be over here on the other side of the world acting like, this is just their latest proxy war that they're getting involved in. But for Europe, this is their continent. This this is very real for them. It could spread even further. And they've said as much, when you see European leaders talking about Russian President Putin and claiming that he wants to, conquer the entire continent, yet they're the ones who are bringing war to it. So how do you see that kind of developing for Europe? And is there a chance of the public fighting back, given the recent elections that we've seen where there has been more of a conservative and right-wing push from voters?
Well, I just think the main mistake the Europeans made was after the Cold War, there was obviously all power concentrated in the United States, and the Europeans, they very much bought into the idea of liberal hegemony. That is a collective hegemony of the West, but it will be based on two pillars, the United States and the EU, in this common partnership. And this, of course, I think it was always a bit delusional, but at least it worked to some extent in the first years. But the problem is this was premised on the perpetuity of unipolarity. But now that you have multipolarity, well, the whole formula changes, because in a multipolar system, you want to diversify your partnerships if you want to be a really independent pole of power. But when we enter these conflicts, the EU tries to resist it by committing themselves more to unipolarity. That means they're cutting themselves off deliberately from the Russians, the Chinese, and at least in this country, they see the United States becoming a bit weakened and also shifting their priorities to Asia. So what is the solution? Diversify? No. They double down. So here we're going to open American military bases left and right, hoping it will increase our value to the Americans. While cutting ourselves off from other centers of power. So it's just becoming weaker, less competitive, more dependent. And as we become less relevant, that is Europe, I think it just increases the incentive for Trump to shift his eyes on Asia. So it's all, it's all very, very foolish. I have a hard time understanding exactly what the politicians are doing. And as you said, the Europeans bet everything on this war, because if you, for example, go back to 2008, when the decision was made to offer future membership to NATO to Ukraine, Merkel called it said that the Russians would interpret it as a declaration of war. Everyone knew that this was a disaster; it would result in war, but they went along anyways, knowing that redividing the continent, militarizing these dividing lines, would create problems with Russia. And even the former finance minister of Germany recognized that a few days ago. He pointed out that now that the sanctions come, of course the Americans will make sure that it benefits them while it harms Europe. Even Merkel had memoirs came out a few weeks ago, when she argued that during her time the US attempts to sabotage the Nord Stream was because they wanted to sell expensive LNG, and this allows them also to cannibalize the European industry. So they know what is happening, but nonetheless they went along with this because they believed that they could break Russia quite quickly on the battlefield and isolate it in international affairs, destroy its economy, and they turned out not to be true. But they bet everything on this war against Russia, and now it's being lost. And what the Americans are saying is, well, we've had enough, we're pulling a bit back. And Trump suggests that you can take over Europe, it's your mess. So it's a historical foolish thing that was done, because you can demonize Russia all we want, but at the end of the day, its security concerns were quite legitimate. This was well known in Europe for the past 30 years. If you try to push NATO all the way up to its borders in Ukraine, there will be war. The Europeans knew this, Americans knew this, we did it anyways, and now we're in this mess, and we keep doubling down, and I think it's just a disaster. At some point, we should start to rethink what we've done and try to salvage what we can.
Yeah, it's still, when I look back at it again, going back to the fact that, as you were saying there, Russia has made it very clear what its security concerns are, and it's been that way for decades. This is not as if, in late 2021, Putin came forward with a list of demands and the West just said, oh, absolutely not. That came out of nowhere. No, he's been incredibly consistent for the entire time that he's been in office. And now, going to the possibility of peace talks, we have the Trump administration coming in. We have Trump's special envoy, who is Army Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. He's saying that his goal is to mediate a resolution within the first 100 days of Trump's second term. And both he and Trump have really focused on the importance of kind of getting Zelensky and Putin together in a room and getting them talking. And they haven't really said what they think should happen, but it's as if they think, oh, we'll get these two leaders together, they'll work something out. But given that Russia is in a position where it is currently winning this war, it doesn't look like Ukraine is going to have any kind of wonder weapon that is going to magically change things short of literal World War III, with NATO getting increasingly involved. How do you view the possibility of talks that could actually lead to some kind of a resolution?
Well, I think, again, I think with Trump, he's genuine in his desire to get an end to the war, but I'm not sure if he appreciates how the complexity of it now, because this war is a conflict on three layers. One is domestic within Ukraine, that is the suppression of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, the language, culture, religion, media, political parties, everything has been they've been de-Russified to a large extent. This was a source of the civil war. Again, William Burns, the CIA director, he more or less predicted this would happen if you try to de-Russify Ukraine. Anyways, so you had a civil war. And second, the layer would be a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, the third, which sparked this whole thing, is the regional conflict between NATO and Russia. So you have to kind of come with a huge, big European security agreement in order to solve this. So the big piece is really between NATO and Russia. We need a European security agreement, security architecture, one that's mutually acceptable. We never established this after the Cold War, and this is why we have a war today. And it's hard, but this is also why NATO should have started negotiations. We don't need the Ukrainians to lay the foundations for what a proper security order is. This idea that we just keep expanding NATO further to Russian borders, move our military infrastructure, our missiles closer and closer to Russian borders, that this was the recipe for stability and peace. It was always nonsense, but nonetheless, we would just say, oh, it's democracy and freedom, it's okay, Russia should be happy. They get stability on their borders, So it was always, very, very foolish. So, anyways, I think this is why peace agreement is very complicated. And again, at the foundation of peace has to be what was agreed upon in Istanbul, and that was neutrality for Ukraine. In Istanbul in 2022, that was the main, if not only thing the Russians were after, which they weren't willing to compromise on. The mediators said the same thing. Both the Israeli and the Turks said what was important for the Russians was for Ukraine to be neutral, no more NATO. And this is what the British and Americans sabotaged. And of course, after 3 years of war, realities have changed on the ground. So now it can be referred to as Istanbul Plus, which is neutrality for Ukraine plus accept the loss of these territories. Exactly where the borders will go, all of this, of course, can be negotiated. But as you know, this is a very hard piece to sell, and it's very difficult for Trump to accept this. I'm assuming he's going to throw in something, turn on China, will give you this, but also that's not going to work, because that's very important for Trump. But America's been the one main country that's been looking to destroy Russia for the past 3 years, and China's been the one that has done the most to help and save Russia. So for Russia to, go against China in any agreement, none of this would ever work. So I think any peace, according to what Russia demands, would be perceived perhaps as a capitulation in Washington. It could be also too humiliating for Trump to accept, given that he's the big deal maker. And so if no deal can be made, the Russians will just solve it on their own on the battlefield. And sadly, this will lead to even more death and misery, which Ukraine, as well as Russia, has seen more than enough of over the past 3 years. So I'm a bit cynical, or skeptical at least, what can be achieved. But at least we're talking about peace. After 3 years of refusing to sit down with Russians while hundreds of thousands of people die, no one making negotiations a naughty word. Now at least people want to sit down and talk. So I see this as very positive, but yes, skeptical nonetheless.
Yeah, I'm right there with you because even just looking at the possibility of what they could offer each other, right? What they could agree to, one of the biggest problems that we've had, especially for the last couple of years, has been the fact that Zelensky and the Biden administration, they all approach this as if Russia is the losing side, right? They'll come up with Ukraine's peace plan or victory plan or whatever you want to call it. It always treats Russia as if they are the ones losing and Ukraine is somehow, victorious on its end, when the reality is very different. I mean, we have Russian forces making gains in the Donbass, recently taking the key Ukrainian transit hub of Karahovo, getting even closer to the Ukrainian logistics hub of Pokrovsk. And then you have Kiev over here in this other world where they're launching a counteroffensive in Russia's Kursk region, or they're, firing long-range weapons deep inside Russian territory, acting as if we just hit Russia here or attack them there, then that will force them into a deal. And Russia has made it very clear that's not going to work. So what kind of a place does that put NATO in, where they refuse to even kind of consider a reality where not only is Russia winning, but there's nothing that they can do about that or can do to stop that, short of kicking off World War III, in which we all inevitably lose?
No, it's that's a good question, but it's worth. I think the main problem is that we refuse to accept that Russia sees this as an existential threat, which is why when our solution is, okay, listen, we're going to strike Russia a little bit, and we're going to offer a ceasefire for a few years, or they have to give up, so pull back from where they were, but at least NATO going to have to, we're going to have European peacekeepers, NATO membership. This is all delusional, but it goes back to the idea that we don't seem to accept, or the political leadership here doesn't seem to accept that Russia sees this an existential threat, irrespective of what we think. This is how the Russians sees it, and that's what they act upon. In terms of, I think another problem is this idea that the front lines are stagnant, or we're winning. I mean, for so many years, 2 years, we said we're winning, and then now we're saying that the front lines are stagnant. I'm not sure if this is deceptive propaganda or if they're genuinely ignorant, because I make the point that the reason why the front lines haven't moved much is that this is a war of attrition. NATO poured in all our weaponry, emptied our weapon storages, and sent it all into Ukraine. And in a war of attrition, it's about bleeding the adversary. Why would you go for some trophy territory and storm well fortified front lines, take huge casualties, if the end game is to bleed the adversary? Again, NATO has said that they're not going to do any peace agreement with Russia. They said this will be solved on the battlefield. We refuse to even sit down with the Russians. This is then signaling it's a war of attrition. We'll fight to the last man. Or as Lindsey Graham said, it's a great path. The Ukrainians will fight to the last man. We send the weapons. Everything is great. But in a war of attrition, you first knock out all the manpower, the military equipment. Once they're weakened, then you take the territory. So I think a lot of people act upon this wrong assumption that this war is stagnant. There's a balance. Nobody can win. It simply is not correct. You see, the losses of Ukraine compared to the Russians is not just very skewed, but it's getting worse every day, because the Ukrainians are having less trained manpower. They have more desertions. They have worse equipment. Everything is going from bad to worse. And now that the front lines are being thinned out on the Ukrainian side, we suddenly see the Russians being able to encircle larger groups of Ukrainian forces. Just today, when the Ukrainians had to flee some of the northern parts of Kursk, the Russians could just knock out all of the people fleeing quite easily. So in the past, it was maybe one for each Russian casualty. There were 4 Ukrainians. Now it's more like 1 to 10. So it just keeps getting worse and worse. So nothing is stagnant here. And you see this with the front lines as well. In the beginning of the war, if the Russians took a town, every single building was bombed to the ground before they could move forward. Now you see many villages becoming almost completely intact, because it's becoming easier to move forward. And with this, now you see, of course, the territory is shifting hand now that the Ukrainian army is exhausted. So this has to be the foundation when we assume what will happen if we don't have a peace agreement, because this idea that it's stagnant, it's also very foolish. But I can never tell if they actually believe this nonsense, or if they're just spinning it. I'm hoping they're spinning it, because at least then there's some common sense, within these people.
Yeah, I think Trump is definitely in for a bit of a wake-up call when he gets into office. And I'm hoping that the people that are around him are honest with him, right? That tell him, look, this is the situation we are seeing right now. This is what's actually going on. And these are the options that we have, because there is certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Glenn Diesen, a geopolitical analyst, author, and professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Yeah, thank you.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and also new episodes of my exclusive weekly series for paid subscribers called Sanction. You can also find Sanction over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.